You want to learn Jenkins, and you want to learn Jenkins fast. Well, you've come to the right place. Hi, I'm Cameron McKenzie. I'm the editor-in-chief over at theserverside.com, and I've put together this Jenkins crash course tutorial to get you up to speed quickly. If you give me just 90 minutes or so of your time, I'm going to make you very, very dangerous when it comes to this Jenkins CI tool. And I guarantee you that you're going to learn more than you might learn in a week-long Jenkins class. If you stick around, I'm going to teach you how to install Jenkins, but we're going to do that quickly because I want to get into the real practical stuff. We're going to create build jobs from scratch. Yeah, from scratch. So if you're a beginner, this course is perfect for you. But after we create our first build job, we're going to create our first pipeline. So if you want to learn about Jenkins Pipelines, this is the right course for you as well. We're then going to go back to Jenkins build job and look at how we can parameterize them. We're going to then go back to Jenkins Pipeline and see how we can explore environment variables. We'll then start creating CI builds where we continuously integrate code we pull from GitHub, GitLab, Bitbucket. We'll then compile that code with Maven. We'll run tests with Gradle. We'll use static analysis codes to make sure that the code meets quality gates that we have set for it. We'll even go so far as to pull down some source code for a Spring Boot developed microservice. We're going to take that Spring Boot microservice, compile it, package it, put it in an executable jar file, create a Docker image out of it, and even push that Docker image into the cloud, get it hosted up there on Docker Hub, and really truly create a continuous integration, continuous delivery pipeline with Jenkins. And all you got to do is give me 90 minutes, maybe up to 2 hours of your time, and we'll cover all of this. But first, we got to get Jenkins installed, and that's what we're going to do right now. So the first thing you got to do if you want to learn Jenkins is install Jenkins. And in fact, that's the second thing you got to do because you got to install the JDK first because Jenkins is written in Java. Now, I'm going to go over the highlights here. I've got a tutorial on the server side and a video on YouTube about installing Jenkins. So if you want a leisurely pace of how to install it, go check those out. I just find people that come to my crash courses want to get into the practical quickly, and I feel the same way. But as far as installing Java goes, you got to do that first. Just go to adoptium.net, download the Java 17 installer. Jenkins doesn't support Java 21 yet, and then just double click it and specify an install location, specify that you want Java added to the operating system's path, have Java Home configured, and within just a moment, you'll have Java installed on your local operating system. Then go over to Jenkins, download the installer for your operating system. I'm on Windows. A quick double click opens up the Jenkins installer. It asks me where I want to install Jenkins. It asks me how I want to run Jenkins. I say that I want to run it just as a local system user, which is fine for learning. Then I'm going to test to make sure that port 8080 is available because Jenkins runs as a web app on port 8080. If it is, I click next. It verifies that Java Home was found, asks if you want to start everything up as a service, which of course you do. And then that's it. Jenkins gets installed. Now, there is a configuration step that happens after that. After the installation happens, you'll want to go to localhost 8080. Give it a bit of time because it'll take a while for everything to be configured. But when you go there, the first thing it's going to do is it's going to ask you to go and open a file on your file system and type in a special secret key that it planted on your OS to make sure that the first person to log into Jenkins is someone who has access to the server that Jenkins was installed on. So get that key, paste it in. Then after that, well, it'll ask you to install plugins. Just install the suggested plugins. That's the best way to start. That'll add things like, I don't know, things like a Git plugin and an LDAP plugin and a pipeline. Just accept the defaults, click next, 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 next. When that installs, it's then going to ask for a user. And if this is just a local installation for training, just Jenkins is the name, Jenkins is the password, Jenkins is the full name, jenkins@example.com is fine for the email address. Then just finish the installation. It'll say that, the instance will be configured and up and running in a moment. Just click the button to say start using Jenkins, and then all of a sudden Jenkins will appear on localhost 80, 80. And there you go. That is the installation of Jenkins. And once you got that done, well, the first thing you should do is create your first Jenkins build job, which is exactly what we're going to do next. So we've got Jenkins installed. We've got Jenkins running on port 8080. Why don't we kick things off by creating a new Jenkins build job. Now I'm going to create just a simple Hello World Jenkins build job to start off, but I'm going to follow it up with a Jenkins Hello World pipeline. I see a lot of tutorials where they do nothing but build jobs and then do pipelines when everybody's bored, or they do nothing but pipelines and never address what build jobs are. Both are important, so I'd kind of like to do them both at the same time. But we're going to start off with a basic build job. Build jobs are designed as freestyle projects using the GUI tools. So you click on that new item link, you type in a name. I'll call it my first Jenkins build job. It'll be a freestyle project. Notice the option below, pipeline. So pipeline is a scripted pipeline, a declarative pipeline. A build job would be a freestyle project that uses the GUI tools. Both are great, and I'm going to do the Jenkins build job right now. After I've given it a name, I'll click OK. You notice that the initial configuration just asks you for some standard stuff. Do you want to discard builds after they're done? Maybe your builds are going to take up a lot of resources. Do you want to throttle them a little bit? So some interesting configuration at the start. Remember, Jenkins at its heart is a continuous integration tool. Continuous integration means getting code that's checked into a repository, pulling it out, compiling it, running tests, make sure that it all works. So one of the important things that you can configure here is a source code management tool. Now, we're not going to get into Git quite yet, but we will. But right now, I'm going to leave that blank. I'm going to look at the build triggers. Now, as you could imagine, if you're using Jenkins to automate a task, if you're using Jenkins to do continuous integration, the question arises, when should these Jenkins build jobs be triggered? Should they be triggered every day, every night, every time somebody checks some code into GitHub? Well, all of those options are available. Notice one of them is GitHub hook trigger. That will fire off the Jenkins build job anytime somebody checks some code into a particular branch, maybe the development branch, maybe the master branch. Pull SCM. Jenkins can query GitHub or GitLab or whatever source code management tool you're using and check to see if there's been a new commit. And if there has, it'll run the build job. If not, well, just leave things alone. There's also build periodically. This uses a cron job syntax of minute, hour, day, month, day of week. So if I did something like this, I said */3, that means this job will run every 3 minutes. I'll just put a star in for each of the others. Got to be a space in between those bug splats there. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So that's actually going to schedule this job to run every 3 minutes. Now, what are we going to do in this job? Oh boy, that's a lot of documentation there. Click the little question mark to get that to go away. Notice that Jenkins gives us a little static here. It says every 3 minutes is a lot to run a build. Maybe *3 on the hour instead of *3 on the minute. But I'm like, nah, I like to live dangerously. I'll do it every 3 minutes. And then you'll notice that some information about the build environment. So we can set up secret files, credential files, terminate a build if it's stuck, right? Sometimes you might have a hard time connecting to a network resource and your build might hang for a little while, so you can have it terminated. What I'm interested in right now is adding some build steps to this Jenkins build job that's going to run every 3 minutes. And notice that one of the options is to execute a Windows batch command. There's also, if you were running on Linux, Ubuntu, you would use execute shell, obviously. There's also options to invoke Ant, invoke Gradle, invoke Maven, right? Those are your most commonly used build tools. And there's plugins that come pre-configured in Jenkins for Gradle, Ant, and Maven. And that's why those options are there. If there's something that you want to use that's not there, just install a plugin and it'll magically appear. But I'm going to do a little Windows batch file magic, and I'm just going to echo, hello world from my Jenkins build job, from my first Jenkins build job or something like that. And that's about it. I'm going to click save there. You can click apply. You can click save. Apply does a save, but it keeps you in the wizard. Save, it doesn't apply, but then it takes you back to the landing page, the place you previously were in Jenkins. Here it's taken me back to the display page for the job. I notice there's a bunch of links here. There's not much status because I've never run this job, but there is a play button there that says build now, and I can't resist a button that says build now. So I'm going to click build now. You'll see that I got a green check mark in the bottom left-hand corner there. I'm pretty happy about that. I can click on that. That'll give me some information about the build. Specifically, I want to see the console output, and there you go. Hello world from my Jenkins build job. And that's how easy it is to create your first Jenkins build job and run it and see the output of it. And if you go back to the dashboard over here, you can see it listed there on the landing page. By the way, if you ever get lost in Jenkins, you get deep into some links, I always say, just click on the Jenkins head. The Jenkins head will just take you back to normal, take you back to the landing page, and you can see all of your different Jenkins build jobs. You can see there haven't been any problems lately, so the sun is shining on it, and it looks like the last time it ran was 44 seconds ago, and everything was good. And there you go. That's how easy it is to create your very first Jenkins build job. Stick around, because what's next? Building your very first Jenkins pipeline. So we just finished building our first Jenkins build job using the GUI tool, a nice little Hello World application. Now I want to go in and do the exact same thing, but do it differently. I want to create a Jenkins pipeline. So I'm going to create new item, click pipeline, and call it my first Jenkins pipeline. Now, what are we going to do in this pipeline? What we're going to do is, well, we're going to print out Hello World, just like we did in the build job, so you can see the difference right away. The other thing I'd like to do, I'd like to play with some environment variables. So show you some of the environment variables that you can access when you're working with Jenkins, and show you some of the environment variables that are available. Now, if you want to create a pipeline job, you give it a name, you click the Super Mario's pipe on there, you click OK, and well, the page that you're taking to looks very similar to the build job page, right? Because a lot of the things are going to be the same. Basic configurations like discarding old builds is there. Build triggers, right? When you're creating a Jenkins pipeline, what triggers it? Is it triggered every hour? Is it triggered by a commit to Git? Should we pull our source code management tool, pull SCM, and see if a new commit has happened to it? So we saw all of those options over when we created a regular build job. But here's where it gets different. Notice there's no option to add a build step or add a post-build action. Instead, it says, you want to do something? You better start writing some code, or at least writing some groovy Jenkins DSL stuff that describes what your continuous integration build should do. Now, how do you get started here? Well, you get started by clicking on the samples there. There's a Hello World sample, a GitHub and Maven sample, a scripted pipeline sample. Let's just start with the Hello World sample, okay? And you can see it starts off, it uses the word pipeline. There's something called a declarative pipeline. There's something called a scripted pipeline. We're trying to stick to declarative pipelines today, where you don't put a lot of code into your pipelines. In the past, you could put a bunch of Groovy or Kotlin code into your pipelines, and that was very effective, but they would become unmanageable over time. Now we like to have declarative pipelines, start with the word pipeline, and if we do need some complex code, we use a shared library. So you can see the agent is any. That just means this can run anywhere. Sometimes you might have a build job that requires, I don't know, some special GPU. So you could say this should only run on machines that have the special GPU on it, but this can run anywhere. There's stages here. We've only got one stage, the hello stage, because it's welcoming, and there's only one step. It's printing out hello world from a Jenkins pipeline, from my first Jenkins pipeline. Okay, let's start there. Let's click apply, click save, click apply, then build the job. Let's just make sure it works. Then we're going to come back in, we're going to add another stage, and we're going to see if we can echo out some environment variables, see what environment variables are available to us. So apply, that saves but leaves you on the page. Save, that saves but takes you to the build page's landing page. You can see the option there to build now. That's what I'm going to do. I'm going to build it right now. And as soon as it runs, you see a slightly different GUI. It shows you the stage that ran. Hello. I can click on this. It gives me an option to look at the logs. Do I want to? Yes, I do. And there's that log file there. Hello world from a Jenkins pipeline. So we know that our Jenkins pipeline ran. If you want more details, you can always go where that green checkbox is right over there. Click on it, and then you get the same sort of stuff that you see for a regular Jenkins build job, right? So it's a different approach to developing your build rather than the GUI tool. It's giving you the ability to describe your build job, your continuous integration, continuous delivery cycle in code. The GUI tools are great. I love them. I recommend them. I use them. But one of the problems with the GUI tool, with the Jenkins build job, like the first Jenkins build job we created, is it's very difficult to put that into a source code management tool, right? If you have a Jenkins build job that is just a piece of code, just a chunk of DSL, domain-specific language, you can check that into source code. You can check it into source code along with your project's code. You can version it. You can maintain a history. If something goes wrong, you can see who made the commit that changed it. So those are some of the big benefits of working with pipelines, right? Being able to manage it through version control, maintaining a history of it, very compelling in an enterprise environment. Now, I want to go and edit that Jenkins build job, and I'm completely lost as to where I am inside Jenkins. If I said before, whenever you're lost, always just click on the Jenkins head and it takes you back to the landing page. Now there's my first Jenkins build job and my first Jenkins pipeline. I'm going to click on my first Jenkins pipeline. When I come in here, I've got the option over on the left to configure. That's got the cogwheel on it. I'm going to click configure, scroll down to where all of that code was. And I'm going to make some changes. I'm going to add a stage. So a little copy and paste here. Make sure you copy all the right braces. And now the steps, it's not going to be hello. I'm going to call it environment. And I'm not going to echo out text. I'm going to echo out some environment variables. And I've actually brought up a page in Jenkins. It's actually on your localhost, and localhost 8080/nv-vars.html. I'll show you all the different variables that are available to you. And this list grows the more plugins that you add into Jenkins. So if you're using the Git plugin, you can get the branch name, whether the branch is primary. You can get tag timestamps. For Jenkins build job, you can get the job display URL, the run URL, the build number, the job name, the build tag, the node name, there's a lot of environment variables here. And you can use these in your scripts, and commonly people do. I'm just going to echo out the environment env.build ID. I'm going to echo out the env. You can do dot and control space, and you can see like not just the variables that are available to you, but all of these different objects that are available to you through the whether it's Kotlin or Groovy programming language, right? So a whole bunch of classes, packages, components that are available that you can code with. I'm going to have job name. Right, now let's print out the job name and echo env.jenkins home. That's an interesting one. So when Jenkins runs and Jenkins creates build jobs, and when Jenkins pulls things from Git or GitHub or GitLab or Bitbucket, where does it put it? Puts it all in Jenkins home. Okay, that's fine. Where is Jenkins home? that echo is going to tell me. Now I'm just going to check to make sure I spelled all of that correctly, and I think I did. But again, we've got a pipeline. We've got two stages. One prints out hello world, one prints out environment variables. I'm going to click apply. I'm going to click save. I'm going to click save. I'm going to click apply. I'm going to click build now. The display is going to change a little bit. A new stage has been added, environment. I'm going to click on the logs for environment. This will show me, well, it shows me where Jenkins home is, shows me the name of the build job, and it shows me the ID, the number of the build that just happened. Interesting about the Jenkins home, I'm going to copy that, control copy, paste that in there, and that copy was not good. I have to highlight it all, click control C, then I can paste it in. And yeah, you can see this is all information about all of the different build jobs that have happened. I can click on workspace there. Notice there's a workspace for a variety of different Jenkins build jobs that have been created for plugins, for nodes, for logs as well. If you lock yourself out of Jenkins, sometimes you can go in here and find some of the security components and turn security off. But yeah, that's your Jenkins home. And so there we go. That is a look at, well, not just Jenkins pipelines, but also writing some cool code that takes advantage of Jenkins environment variables. So, you know, we're getting into some advanced stuff right now. One of the things I'd also like to take a look at is maybe parameterizing a build job. We can handle environment variables. Well, let's pass in parameters as well. I think you're going to find that very cool. That's next. So we've created our first Jenkins build job and our first Jenkins pipeline. Now I want to advance our knowledge of Jenkins and create a parameterized Jenkins build job. The idea here is we want to print out the version of Java. Maybe when the program starts, we want to verify that Java is installed. We want to know that we're using the right version. So we'll create a Jenkins build job to print out the Java version. It's just a simple Java command, java-version. Now, in order for that to work, you have to have the Java JDK's bin directory on the path. So just you might want to do this check first. And I don't have it on the path, so I'm going to have to find out where the Java's bin directory is. Looks like it's on C Tools JDK17 bin. I'm going to add that over here to the path, and then everything should be good in the world. But as I was mentioning, I want to be able to print out the version of the JDK that's installed and that's active, but I want to turn that off too. Like we may hit a situation where, you know, the Java's busy or we don't want to know the version. So it's a feature I want to turn on and off. So here's how you do this. You create a new item, and I'm going to call this the parameterized version build job. It's a freestyle project, not a pipeline, but this concept applies 100% to pipelines too. You'll see a lot of parameterized pipelines if you start doing a lot of DevOps work with Jenkins. You'll see them with Jenkins build jobs as well. I'm going to click OK, and then I'm going to find that option that says this project is parameterized. Click the checkbox, and I'll look at the different parameterizations Jenkins provides. You can do a Boolean parameter, credentials parameter, file parameter, password parameter, run parameter, string parameter, and a choice parameter. And I'm a big Devo fan. Freedom of Choice was the first album I ever bought. I'm going to select a choice parameter. And what am I going to call it? I'm going to call it should we print it out? Don't laugh at the way I say out. Should we print it out? So we're going to have a parameter that says either yes or no to printing out the Java version. And the choices are going to be yes and no. Now, by the way, you might see that a red exclamation mark. Do you see the red exclamation mark there on the page? Okay, if you do, get your eyes checked because it's a white exclamation mark inside of a red circle. That exclamation mark is not red. The point is, it's saying to me this requires choices. Sometimes Jenkins, if you like that joke, say something in the comments. Sometimes Jenkins will say there's an error when it's been fixed. You have to move to another form in the tool. So if I tab away, boom, the error goes away. So just Jenkins throws you off a little bit from time to time. But pay attention to that choice parameter. Should we print it out? Yes or no? I'm now going to create a build step. So I'm going to add a build step, execute Windows build step. And in here, I'm going to say if that parameter, and I'm actually going to go up and copy that parameter just so that there's no funny business here. Right, because if I do this, if I spell it wrong, it's uppercase, lowercase, something like that, I'll mess it up. So I'll say if should we print it out equals yes, then what we will do is that java-version command, and if percentage should we print it out percentage quote equals no, then we will just echo out, okay, I'll be quiet, with an exclamation mark to indicate shouting. Okay, and there we go. We've now created a little build step here that performs some logic based on a parameter that we've supplied to this job. Now, anytime anybody runs this job, they've got to provide that should we print it out parameter, either provide yes or no. Now, how do they do that? Well, hold your horses. I'm going to show you. Now, sometimes I've seen it where the first execute batch command doesn't run. So we'll see how this goes. But I'm going to click build with parameters. And notice now it actually asks me to provide input on that field. Yes or no. I'm going to say yes. And now I click build. Previously, you just had a button that said build now. It wouldn't stop you for parameters. Now it does. So I'm going to click build now. Keep my fingers crossed that this runs excellently the very first time. As I said, I have seen sometimes where you have to do the second build step, but I'll do the console output. And there you go. Open JDK version 17. Java 21 is coming out soon. You should pay attention to that, but 17 is good as well. Okay, and let's run this again. Build with parameters, and let's say no. And click build. Wait a second. Click on that. Check the console output. It says, okay, I'll be quiet. And so there you go. That's how easy it is to add a parameter to a Jenkins build job. Now, just so you know, some people are doing this as like, I only want to see pipelines. I don't know. This applies to pipelines too. So if I looked at my first Jenkins pipeline and clicked on configure, you'd see that there's also that option to parameterize a Jenkins pipeline as well. So syntax might be a little bit different because you're going to be accessing the variable inside of a pipeline, so it's going to be more groovy based, but the concept is the same. You can parameterize Jenkins jobs normally, or you can parameterize Jenkins pipelines. Anyways, there you go. That is how you parameterize a Jenkins pipeline. Now we're going to do something Jenkins build job. We're going to do something very, very similar, but also very, very different in the next exercise, which is getting input from the user in a Jenkins pipeline. Now, again, it looks like we got input from the user with a parameterized Jenkins build job, but this is going to be different. So it's going to be exactly the same, but it's going to be completely and totally different. Okay, and that's what we're going to take a look at next. Okay, we successfully created our Jenkins parameterized build job that printed out the version of Java that's installed. What's next is creating a Jenkins pipeline that will print out the version of Maven, Gradle, and Git that's installed. And you may be wondering, when did I install Maven and Git? Well, I did that just a second ago. And not only did I do that, but I also configured the appropriate environment variables, and I even added them to the path. So that's all done. By the way, if you do that and you want to run this particular example, if you do install something and update the environment variables, you're going to need to do a restart on Jenkins. It only reads those variables right when it starts up. So with that done, it's time to actually go in and build our pipeline, but not before I talk a little bit about what Jenkins does. You see, Have you ever looked at the Jenkins mascot? The Jenkins mascot is a butler. And Jenkins was a fork of Hudson. Now, I get in trouble for calling Jenkins a fork because the people on Jenkins say it wasn't a fork, but that's a whole other matter. The point is, before Jenkins, the product was called Hudson. And both the name Hudson and Jenkins are the names commonly used for butlers in TVs and movies. And the inside joke in the DevOps community, in the Java community, is that Jenkins does nothing because butlers do nothing. And if you think about it, it's true, right? A butler doesn't do anything. Despite what you may have seen by watching Joffrey and the Fresh Prince of Bel-Air reruns, the butler doesn't cook. The butler organizes the chefs. The butler doesn't do housekeeping. The butler organizes the housekeepers. The butler doesn't clean the pool. The butler organizes the groundskeepers. The butler does nothing, right? All it does is calls on other people to do things for them. And Jenkins is the same way. So if you want to pull from GitHub, Jenkins can't do it. It gets Git to do it. If you want to manage a dependency, Jenkins can't do it, but it gets Maven to do it. If you want to build and test a Spring Boot project, Jenkins can't do it, but it can get Gradle to do it, and so on and so on and so on. So if you want to do anything interesting in Jenkins, well, you need to install the tools and maybe even some plugins as well, because Jenkins can't do it on its own. So that's the inside joke, and that's why the mascot for Jenkins is a butler, because Jenkins doesn't do anything. But despite that, it's still an awesome and amazing CI/CD automation tool. I'm not dissing it. I'm just letting you all in on the joke. Now, we do have Jenkins, we do have Maven, Gradle, and Git installed. I'd like to follow the path that we did before with the parameterized Jenkins build job, where we asked the user before it ran whether they wanted to print out the Java version or not. I like to print out the Maven, Gradle, and Git version. And I'd like to get input from the user, but not before. I want to get the input as the pipeline runs. This is going to be some seriously advanced Elon Musk stuff right here. So pay attention. And if you just want to watch as it starts to get advanced, don't feel bad, because I'm going to have some really advanced code on here. It's good enough to see it happening and think, hey, that's cool. I'll also link to the code in the description and also on the article on the server side for it. So you can always check that out. But we're going to go back into the pipeline world. We're going to create a new pipeline, and we're going to call it the input check version info pipeline. It's a bad name, but I'm a bad person, so there you go. And we're going to head on down here to the script section, and I'm going to start off with a little hello world script. I just like to start off, let Jenkins give me the start there. I'm actually going to copy the stage and just create a second stage, just because it's more interesting when a pipeline has two stages. I could do all this in the first stage, but I want a couple of stages here. So I'm going to leave the hello world alone and add a second stage and call it the software versions stage. And I'm not going to get any input from the user yet. You got to walk before you can run. So first off, I'm just going to print out. So I'm going to use a batch command to say mvn -- version. I'm going to use the batch command to say Gradle -- version. And I'm going to do a batch command to say Git -- version. By the way, I got a bunch of Git tutorials online. You should check them out if you're interested in Git. I'm just looking at that. Does that all look good? 2 dashes with Maven, Gradle, and Git, 1 dash with Java. I'm going to click apply. I'm going to click save. I'm going to click save. I'm going to click apply. And then I'm going to do the build now. And this should run. It should print out the versions of all these software. In the hello, it just says hello. That's to be expected. The software versions, well, we can see the version of Git, we can see the version of Maven, we can see the version of Gradle. That all looks awesome. Now, maybe we don't always want to print that stuff out. Maybe we want to ask the user as the pipeline runs, hey, Do you want to print this stuff out? Now, the analogy is it could be asking the user, hey, do you want to deploy into production? Hey, do you want to commit this to the main branch? I mean, we could be asking the user anything as the continuous integration, continuous deployment Jenkins pipeline runs. Here we'll just be asking them if they want to print out some version data. Now, there is going to be some nasty code in here. And it's not that nasty if you're used to coding, but it's a lot of code to type out. I'm going to paste it in just because I'm not a good coder. Just seriously, that's on my LinkedIn resume. And so what I'm going to do here is inside these steps, I think maybe I'll just tab that in a little bit. And right off the bat, I'm going to add a script element. So I've got to say, I'm going to put a little bit of script in here. You're not supposed to put a lot of script into your Jenkins pipelines. It's a bad idea. There used to be scripted pipelines and declarative pipelines. When you've got a Jenkins pipeline that starts with the word pipeline, that's known as a declarative pipeline. You're not supposed to put a lot of code into it. If you've got a lot of code that you need to do to address a corner case, then you should put that in a shared library and reference it in your code. I actually got a video on YouTube about how to create shared libraries, so feel free to check that out. But occasionally you can put a little bit of script in here. And the script that I want to put in here is to get some input from the user. I want to find out if we should print out these parameters or not. So I'm going to throw a little bit of script in here. Okay, you can see it right there. So def response input message. So we're declaring a variable called response. We're going to be using the input plugin. The message that we're going to send to the user is, should we print the Java version? We're going to ask them yes or no. We'll also give them a proceed or abort button. And then the title of the field will be what to do. So that is kind of the input. An input window is going to come up to the user as the build runs, and we're going to get input from the user. Now, we're going to want to do something when we get that input. So we'll do something like, well, if the response equals yes, then we'll print out the version. Now, one thing to note here is that the syntax of the if statement is different from the syntax of the if statement from the Jenkins build job. That's because the if statement in the Jenkins build job is running as a Windows batch file. If you were on Unix or Linux, it would have to run as obviously a shell script. Here we're actually working in the Groovy programming language. Potentially Kotlin is another option you have. So we're actually in a different programming environment when we're working with the pipeline. But I'm going to click apply there. And I'm going to click save. And I'm going to just double check my code. And I'm going to click build now. And now when this Jenkins build job runs, notice it's paused under software versions. So I now have a pause. If I click here, it says, should we print the Java version? Yes or no. I'm going to click proceed. It goes forward. I look at the logs and notice we've got all of the versions here. Now, there is a couple of errors there. And one of the errors is just in the syntax that I copied. It says, do you want to print the Java version? So I'm going to go in and configure. And it shouldn't be, should we print the Java version? It should be print the software versions, right? So we've got that corrected now. It makes a little bit more sense, but that should work. And yeah, I think I'm going to give that a try now. So I'm going to go over here. I'm going to click apply. I'm going to click save. Now I'm going to build this. And now when it comes up, it looks a lot more handsome. And it says to us, should we print the software versions? I'm going to click no this time. Click proceed. And now, since I've selected no, notice that none of the software versions have run. So there you go. That's how easy it is to configure a Jenkins pipeline to take input from the user. Now, one other thing, we do have that pipeline that prints out the Java version. Okay, so we've got the input check version info and parameterized version build job. So I'm going to go to the parameterized version build job and configure it. And what was the name of that input check version info? So input check version info. I am going to go and configure this parameterized build job that prints out Java. But watch this. I'm going to add a post build action. And the post build action is going to be to build another project. And the other project to build is going to be the input check version info. So now we'll get the Java version, and then it'll actually call on the other build script. So I'm actually going to daisy chain these scripts together. I'm going to click save, and now I'm going to say build with parameters. Should we proceed? Yes. This prints it out. This runs. This will print out all of the information about Java. But now if we go back into the other Jenkins build job, the input check version, notice that it's just been called by the Java version check. And if I click on here, now it's asking me, should we print out the versions of the other projects? And now I click proceed, and it's going to print out the version of Maven and Gradle and Git for me. And so now what we've done is we've used that post build action from the Java version build job. We've had that run, and then when it finishes, it then kicks off a pipeline. So we're now starting to create like a daisy chain, almost like a pipeline of pipelines, right? But that's a pretty cool feature, another interesting feature of Jenkins, and that is the ability to have one Jenkins build job finish and have it call another build job. So some super cool things that we can do with Jenkins. But I promise you, it gets even cooler when we start working with Git and Maven and Gradle and Docker and all of those other tools. And that's what we're going to get into next. You know, I can't believe we've made it this far and we haven't actually built some code yet. I've got my GitHub repository up over here, and as you can see, I've got a project called Spock Lizard Docker, and every GitHub repository has this GitHub URL that anybody can use to pull the code from that repository. Well, anybody if it's public, and if it's private, if you've got credentials, you can do it, but you get the idea. I'm going to copy that GitHub URL, and I'm going to get Jenkins to pull that code down, call on Maven, get the code tested, get the code compiled, get the code packaged, and make sure that everything in this project is working swimmingly. So we're going to do some continuous integration. So how do I do that? Well, I click New Item here, and I'm going to say Build Spock Lizard. This is just going to be a freestyle project. We'll do it as a pipeline in just a moment. I'll click OK. It's going to ask me all of the standard questions. I'm going to go right down to source code management and click Git. It's going to say to me, oh, you want me to clone a repository. What repository? Boom. I'm just going to type in my URL. It's a public repository, so I don't need Git or GitHub credentials in Git. That's all I need to do there. Then it's going to say, oh, it's going to say the branch specifier. We don't really use the master branch anymore. Now we use the main branch. So this is a bit of older project. So I do have a master branch. I'm just looking at that commit from 4 years ago. But nowadays you would use main. So if you do this on one of your own projects, check that branch specifier. Make sure that you have a master branch. You should be using the main verbiage. If you are using main, you may have to double check on that. So please be careful there. So this is going to pull that down. I'm not going to do any build triggers. I'm going to just build this manually. And then what are the build steps? Well, here I could just say add a top level Maven target. And optionally, you could invoke a Gradle target. I'm going to use a Maven target, and I can type in anything I want here. I can say clean compile, test, package, and install. You can choose whichever ones you want. Now, I think if I say install, that includes all of those, so that might be a little excessive, but let's say compile and test, right? So I'll click apply there. That means the code is going to be pulled down, and now we're going to compile the code and test the code. In fact, actually, I could maybe even add like a second build step for testing, but we can do that later. I'll click apply, I'll click save, I'll click build now, and now if I actually take a look at this, I can see the logs in real time here. If I click over on the project, you can see it actually starts going to Git. It's actually downloading the project from Git. It's moving it into the Jenkins home directory, I think under workspaces. It's calling on Maven. So this is the first time Maven's being used in my workspace. So Maven's going to go to Maven Central and pull down a whole bunch of projects and libraries that it's going to need. And once Maven's pulled all those things down, it's going to take a look at the code that Jenkins has pulled down to its local environment. And Jenkins is pulling that code down from GitHub. It's not doing things in the cloud. It's pulling all of that down locally. Then it's going to stick Maven on it, and Maven is going to compile the code and run the tests. And all of the code compiles in true to form. I don't have any tests in my project. It says no test to run, so I guess the build is successful. But I've just now compiled code. I've built code. I've gone down into the code. I've actually run my first build job. And if I actually go over into Git and maybe take a look at one of the files in src main, I'll take a look at the Java code here, something in mcnz Rashamba. I'll take a look at that score class. I'll click on the pencil there. I will remove a semicolon. I will click commit. I will commit the change. After doing that, all of the changes are saved. I'm going to come back to Jenkins. Remember, Jenkins is continuous integration. We could configure this to run every 10 minutes or pull that repository every hour to check if there's any changes. Or we could configure it so that GitHub actually triggers the job every once in a while. I'm going to click build now. And now let's see what happens. Now we did miss a semicolon there. You'll notice that this will run a lot faster this time because it doesn't have to go to Maven. Maven will go to Maven Central to pull down what it needs the very first time. After that, everything's local and it shouldn't be a problem. But all of a sudden, skies are getting cloudy. If I go back to the Jenkins dashboard, you'll notice that I got a little cloud there. It's not sunny in Philadelphia anymore. I've got an X, and what does this mean? Does this mean that I did something wrong? Well, not from the Jenkins standpoint. You go look at the console output, and Jenkins is going to say to you, hey, look, there was a compilation error. There's a semicolon missing at the end of score. And I can't argue with that because I took that semicolon off. But there you go. We throw that semicolon back on, click commit changes. Go back and run this again. Go back to the dashboard, build Spock Lizard, build now, and now the build will be successful. And of course, I'm doing this manually, but if you had this triggered, that's why you configure triggers in your build jobs, to go to the repo regularly, you wouldn't have to do this manually. And the idea is, you know, not only would you have this configured so that it would run at regular intervals, but you would also configure Jenkins with your mail server and put the emails of all the people on your team. And if the build is broken, an email goes out to the team members saying, hey, all hands on deck, the build is broken on the development branch or the master branch or whichever key branch you're pulling from. The other thing to mention too is a compile error is just unforgivable in terms of pushing into a main development branch. You should never have compile errors. More likely than not, it's tests that fail, right? So a failing test will break the build, but so will a compile error. But there you go. That's how you create a Jenkins build job and actually run a build job, pull from GitHub, call on Maven to build and test your code and recognize when the code compiles and recognize when somebody broke the build. And that's how easy it is. Now, it's also pretty easy to do if you're doing this all with a pipeline. But before you run your pipeline, you might want to configure a tool or two. And we're going to take a look at that next. Okay, I want to get into some Jenkins Pipelines soon for building with Maven and building with Jenkins. But, you know, I've been trafficking for a little while on the goodwill of the path, and I shouldn't be. And so first, I'm going to configure some tools. Anytime you work in Jenkins, you're going to work with a tool like Gradle or SonarQube or Checkstyle or Docker or anything like that. You install the tool. So I've installed Maven and Gradle. Then you typically install a plugin. Okay, the Gradle and Maven plugins were already installed by when I did the initial install. But if you were to install SonarQube, you need a SonarQube plugin. And then you do a tool configuration that tells Jenkins about that software that you want to use. Now, as I said, I put Maven and Git and Gradle on the path. And because I did that, Jenkins can kind of pick it up automatically, but we should be configuring tools. So I'm going to click on Manage Jenkins here, and you'll see Tools. And for any tools where you've added a plugin, there's a good chance that you'll have to go in here and configure the tool. So you notice it says JDK installations. Do you have any? Well, I do. I should tell Jenkins about it. And what's the name? I'll call it JDK 17. And it's going to ask me, where is it? And it is c:/_tools/JDK-17. So you want to configure that, right? Also, if you don't have it installed, Jenkins can install it for you, which is super cool. For Git, I've got a default Git installation. I think I'm going to leave that there, path to Git executable. Well, no, maybe I'll just actually configure it properly. So is that the path there? Yes, it is. So there we go. We'll accept the default name. Having a default name is a smart idea. So you can install a bunch of tools because you can install different versions of Git. You can install different versions of Java. If you specify something as default, you can create a bunch of build jobs that just use default. And then when a new version of the tool comes out, rather than having to go back to all of your build jobs and say, okay, we're updating this from JDK 17 to JDK 21, if you just configure default here to JDK 21, then all of the applications that use the default installation would be updated automatically as well. So that's pretty cool. The Gradle installation, I'm going to add a reference to Gradle. So I'll call this Gradle 8. And do we want to install Gradle? No, we don't want to install it. Instead, we'll just say where the Gradle home is. c:/tools/Gradle. Not Bradle, Gradle. Okay, so now we've let the tool know about Gradle 8, Ant installations, and then finally Maven installations. Now, the tool actually assumes a name M3 for a lot of Maven installations. They used to call it M2 for version 2, now M3. Here, I'm not going to install it automatically. I'm just going to point to c:/tools/Maven. And by the way, I mean, I'm not making this stuff up. That's where all of these tools are. Jenkins, Gradle, Git, right? That's a Maven right there. And so tools/Maven. And now I've got Maven, Git, Gradle, even the JDK, all configured here. The tool knows about it. And all of these tools have been given names. So I can reference JDK-17 at any point in time in the future. So from there, I'm just going to click Apply. I'm going to click Save. And I'm just going to be very happy with the fact that, well, all of this has been installed and configured properly. So we just finished creating our Jenkins build job that pulls from GitHub, brings the code down to the local workspace, then calls on Maven to do a build which included compiling the code and testing the code. I want to do exactly the same thing as that, except do it completely differently with a pipeline instead of a build job. So how do you do it? Well, I'm going to come over here, click New Item. The previous project was called Build Spock Lizard. So I'll call this Build Spock Lizard Pipeline. I'll click the Super Mario Brothers icon for the pipeline right there and click OK. I'm also going to go to my GitHub repository and copy that URL to that GitHub repository because I'll need that. Jenkins needs to know where to pull the code from. I'll mosey on down to pipeline here, and you'll notice that one of the options is GitHub plus Maven, and that's going to come in very handy. You'll notice that it says it's going to use the tool called M3 for Maven. Where does that come from? Well, previously I just went in and clicked on Manage Jenkins and configured all of my tools. And if I came down here and looked at Maven installations, you'd see that I named my Maven installation M3 in the tools configuration page of Jenkins. So over here, the script says, hey, whenever we reference Maven, it's that M3 tool that we're going to use. Now it comes down here and it says, what are the steps here? Well, the first step is going to be to build the project using Git. So we just say Git and the name of that Git URL. Now, if anybody here knows Git, you'd know that there's no Git and then URL command. If you tried to do that on a command line with Git, Git would slap you right in the face. That is not a proper Git command. By the way, if you want to learn about Git without getting slapped in the face, I got some great tutorials on YouTube and over at the server side. But what this is this is part of the domain-specific language that Jenkins provides you to help you do things. So when you say Git and then you provide a Git URL, Jenkins is actually going to go out. It's going to go to that repository. I believe it does an init and then a fetch. It doesn't actually do a clone. And I think it does a clone depth 1 so that it only gets, I think, the last commit. And it only goes for like a specific branch. Maybe the specific branch doesn't happen here. Maybe it does. But the point is that it's a whole domain-specific language that helps you do things more efficiently. You don't have to worry about a lot of the nuance of the application. You can see here it says goes and runs Maven as the Unix agent. That's not going to help us out. So I'm going to get rid of that. Instead, I want to run it as the batch file. So that will batch it out. Then once we're done, it's got a couple of post actions where it's going to take the results from any JUnit tests and archive them. I don't know if I'm going to have any JUnit tests to archive here, but that's the idea. Now we've actually got a build that is going to pull from Git, and it's going to use Maven to compile and package the code. Package includes compile and test, and it will actually build a jar file for you. So I'm going to click Apply. I'm going to click Save. I'm going to click Build Now. That should trigger this Jenkins build job. The build job runs. It's going to take a while because it's going to have to pull down all that code from GitHub for this application. We can always take a look at the progress that it's making over here. Take a look at the console output. It's a lot of console output. And of course, here it's giving me that error in terms of the fact that it didn't have tests to record. So the build was successful, but due to the fact that I don't have any tests in my application, it was barking up just a little bit. So I can get rid of that post action right there and send a note to the developers that they need more tests in their applications. So I'm going to build that once again. Now, the next time that I do the build, it's actually going to run much faster. It's going to run much faster because all of those libraries from Maven have already been downloaded. And there we go. We can now take a look at this build. And notice we can see the Git build data. So it tells us that it went to the master branch. Tells us that it was the master branch that was built. We've got the ability to restart from stage. So this is one of the cool things about Jenkins Pipelines, is that it will store the data that's generated per stage. So they're actually stateful. We say that these pipelines are stateful. So if they fail halfway through, they can start up again. That's not a big deal here, but I've worked on projects where a build process can take a day. They may have 1 million tests in their system, and it'll take 24 hours for all of those tests to run. So the ability to make these pipelines stateful is very, very important, because if a pipeline stops and the data, then it's nice for you to be able to pick up halfway through. And in fact, if you actually look at the configuration of a Jenkins pipeline, you'll see that one of the options is to do a trade-off between speed and durability. And that basically means the pipeline won't save as much data so that it'll run faster. But if one of the stages fail, you may have a problem restarting the pipeline midway through. But if performance is an issue and you think that your environment is pretty stable, you can click that, and then that'll improve the speed of your application. So kind of an interesting configuration that you can have there. Pipeline speed, durability, override, performance optimized, less durability, maximum durability. So some cool configuration options with your Jenkins pipeline. And there you go. That's how easy it is to create a Jenkins pipeline that connects to GitHub, builds with Maven, and generates artifacts for you. And in fact, if we were to go onto the file system, take a look at Jenkins Home, we'd be able to go in there and actually find all of the different artifacts that are being created. We could even then push them out potentially to our application server and do a continuous deployment, which we'll take a look at when we actually start getting into working with tools like Docker. So I mentioned earlier that one of the things that people love about a Jenkins pipeline is the fact that it can be made part of source control, right? Like it's configuration and code. You can put it into Git, GitHub, Bitbucket, GitLab. When it's in there, you can version it. You can maintain a history of it. If something goes wrong, you can roll it back to a previous point in time. If somebody makes an error on it, you can find out who it was that made the commit. So having configuration as code is critically important in a modern DevOps environment. However, if we're just creating our pipelines and putting the code right into Jenkins, we're not getting the true benefit of a Jenkins pipeline, right? Because it's still inside Jenkins. It's not with the code. You should physically put it with the code. Now, I've got another repository here called Rock, Paper, Scissors. The other one was Spock, Lizard, Docker, I think. And you'll notice that I've got a file called Jenkinsfile right in the root. Now, I'm demonstrating two things here. The first thing that I'm demonstrating is the fact that it's important, and it's the standard, the best practice, to not code your pipeline inside Jenkins, but instead to put it in a Jenkins file on the file system where you check your code in, right? So it's part of your repository. So you can see my Jenkins file right here. Now, the other thing that I'm pointing out here is the fact that, well, if you took a look at my original pipeline, it would start with the word pipeline. This one that I have in the repository, it actually starts with the word node. This is a scripted pipeline. They look very, very similar. There's scripted pipelines and declarative pipelines. Soon to come, there's going to be YAML pipelines as well. The way that we do things today is with a declarative pipeline. We like to avoid scripted pipelines because people would put too much code into a script, and the benefit of a simple, lightweight build file is lost. You end up having somebody put crazy Kotlin or crazy groovy code into a Jenkins pipeline. They leave, and then no one knows how to maintain the build. So instead, we like to have Jenkins declarative pipelines. They start with the word pipeline, a slightly different syntax. And if you want to use code in them, you're allowed to, but you're supposed to put that code in a shared library and then reference that shared library in your declarative pipeline. It's a best practice. It's the way that build pipelines in Jenkins should be built. By the way, I've got a tutorial on using building library, Jenkins shared libraries, if anybody's interested in taking a look at it. So here we actually have that scripted pipeline. Starts with Node. Looks fairly similar, but it's not completely different. Now, how do you use this? Well, I'm going to get that GitHub URL of this new repository. So I'm going to find that beautiful green button. I'm going to click it. I'm going to copy it. I'm going to come over here. I'm going to go back to the dashboard, and I'm going to create a new item. And I'm going to call it build rock, paper, scissors pipeline. Okay, there we go. It'll be a pipeline. I'll click OK. Now watch this. When I come down here, it says, do you want to write a pipeline script, or do you want to find a pipeline script from SCM, from a source code management system like GitHub, GitLab, Bitbucket, CodeCommit? I'm going to say, yeah. I want to have one from source code management. What's the source code management? Well, it's Git. What's the Git URL? Well, it is Cameron MCNZ, rock, paper, scissors. Do you need credentials? No. What's the branch? Master. Well, I think it's master. Let me come over here. Yeah, it's master on that one. You got to check, because sometimes it's main. If it's main, this isn't going to work. And now I can click apply. I can click save. I can click save. I can click apply. I can say build now. And now as this runs, it's not going to be looking for a build pipeline inside Jenkins. Instead, it's going to pull the repo, pull all the code. And as it pulls all the code for that repo, it's also going to read that Jenkins file. It's going to go through that Jenkins file and do all the steps. Evaluate the version, take a look at environment variables, maybe generate some Java doc, compile the code, do some acceptance testing, and then maybe in the conclusion, I don't know, looks like there's a little question here. What do you think? Wasn't this cool? Yes or no? I think that was the input message that we took a look at just a little while ago in a previous tutorial. I'll say yes, it is, and proceed. And now all of a sudden I've got a full-featured, multi-stage Jenkins pipeline that is now stored as code in the source code repository of the project that I'm building. This is a much, much better way of managing your environment. Take a look at the logs file, and there we see. Isn't that cool? I agree. And there you go. That is the key to working with a Jenkins file. Rather than typing out code, you just specify that you want to pull the configuration of the build from source code management, specify Git or whatever other source code tools you've configured, provide the Git URL. For me, that was GitHub. Specify the branch that the Jenkins file is on, and that's it. You're not writing any code in here. You just write it all in Jenkins. It makes your life so much easier. And there you go. That's a real advancement on your knowledge and understanding of Jenkins and the Jenkins file, and even a look at scripted pipelines versus declarative pipelines. By the way, don't be creating any scripted pipelines anymore. Make sure they're declarative. Anyways, what's next? I'm going to take a look at some cool plugins. There's a lot of reasons why Jenkins got popular, but I would say the biggest reason is its plugin architecture. You see, Jenkins is great at doing the basics, which is, pulling code, compiling it, working with Maven, working with Gradle. But it also provides this plugin architecture where other people can create components that can plug into Jenkins. And if you want to include those products in your build, all you have to do is download those products, download those plugins from the marketplace. So every vendor who thinks that they've got some great tool for testing, for quality assurance, for documentation, for performance monitoring, for load testing, all they have to do is create a Jenkins plugin and then say to you, look, just run this plugin before your build runs or after your build runs or in the middle of your build. And they can now provide that feature, provide that functionality to you. And it's very easy for you to just bring it right into your build. So I'd like to actually add some plugins right now. I'm going to go into Jenkins. I'm going to click on the Jenkins head. I'm going to click Manage Jenkins. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a plugin that does static code analysis to your tools. It will allow you to build your projects, compile your code, run your tests. But after you've built your code and run your tests, it's also going to do the static code analysis where it tries to find bugs, tries to find programmer mistakes, tries to takes a look at the style of your code. Now, the plugin that helps me do this is called Warnings Next Generation. So I go over to plugins, I type in Warnings Next Generation, and of course you don't see anything, and it's because for some reason, Jenkins puts you right onto the updates page right when you come in. So you start looking for a plugin you can't find. It's like, I can't find the plugin. It's like, no, you got to head over to available plugins. And it's called the Star Trek Next Generation. There it is, Star Trek Next Generation. It might be Warnings Next Generation. But by the way, if you come over here, like if you just type in Git, like you could see like the hundreds of different products that they have for Git, right? You know, Git, GitLab APIs, Bitbucket stuff. You know, what for performance? I don't know what. There's performance plugins. Like, there's thousands of plugins, right? Like everybody that wants you to use their tool has a plugin. I'm going to install this Warnings Next Generation plugin. Now, normally when you install a plugin, this is what you do. The first thing you do is you install the software somewhere. So if you want to connect to SonarQube, if you want to use Docker, you've got to have Docker installed. You've got to have SonarQube installed somewhere. So first, if there's some software that you want Jenkins to connect to, you got to install the software somewhere. Then you go into Jenkins and you install the plugin. All the vendors will have plugins that allow you to interact with their software from Jenkins. So you install the software somewhere, maybe SonarQube. You get that running in the cloud or on one of your servers. Then you install the SonarQube plugin or the Docker plugin, whatever plugin you want to use. And then you go into Jenkins Tools. And when you go into Jenkins Tools, you configure the plugin. Just like we configured Gradle and we configured the JDK and we configured Git and we configured Maven in Jenkins Tools, you do the same thing with the plugin. You configure the plugin in Jenkins so Jenkins knows how to talk to it. And from there, you can start using plugins inside of Jenkins. Now, I've got Jenkins up and running here. The next generation Star Trek plugin is installed. And what I'd like to do is I'd like to create a new freestyle project. But in this freestyle project, I'd like to run static code analysis on my rock, paper, scissors application, my rock, paper, scissors repository. You can see it right there. I'm going to copy the Git URL so that I can create a brand new build job, and I'll call it static code analysis. If you're wondering why it's static code analysis, because this analysis sticks to your clothes when you pull it out of the dryer. It's got a little bit of static cling to it. So I'm going to do a static code analysis job that analyzes the code in my rock, paper, scissors application. So I create a new freestyle project. This is all normal stuff. I go to source code management. I select Git. I paste in my URL. You're used to all of this stuff. And then I go down to the build step and I invoke a top level Maven target. Now I'll just do the, well, maybe I'll say I'll use M3, right? We configured M3 as one of the Maven tools. And what's the goal going to be? Well, the Maven goal will be, well, let's compile and test and then finally package this application. Package includes compile and test, so I'm just going to say package. But then I'm going to call in the Maven plugins and I'm going to say, Maven, call in your programmer mistake detection plugin and call in your Findbugs plugin. And then call in your Checkstyle plugin. just to make sure that we're conforming to Czechoslovakian style standards in our code. Now, these are Maven plugins, and Maven is actually going to download these plugins and make them available locally. So the pattern for installing software, install the plugin, configure the plugin for the software, we're actually able to skip a step because Maven is taking care of interacting with the plugin and generating content from it. Remember I said earlier that Jenkins does nothing, right? It just delegates to other tools to do things. Here, Maven is actually doing all the heavy lifting in terms of the static code analysis that's going to happen, but in the end, Jenkins will take credit for it. Now, we haven't done anything with a plugin yet, but watch this. I'm going to add a post build step. And you'll notice one of the options is to record compiler warnings and static code analysis. Now, if you rewound back into this tutorial and you looked at when we added that post build step to trigger another Jenkins build job when one build job finished, that option wouldn't have been there. That option only appears after you install the plugin. That's the magic of these plugins. They add features all over the place in the tool. Sometimes it's new project types to build. Other times it's new menu items. Other times it's extra things in the drop-down menu. But here we've got this option. And of course I want to aggregate and use all of this static code analysis. And so it says, okay, well, which tools are you using? And I see one of them is the tool that will validate Czechoslovakian coding standards. So I use Checkstyle. I say, hey, I want to use Checkstyle. Make sure I hit that harder. Okay, Checkstyle. And it says, is that the only one, or do you want to add another tool? And I said, yeah, I'm going to add Findbugs. And it says, well, are you done yet? And I'm saying, no, I want you to aggregate the results for PMD, programmer mistake detection, as well. And it says, oh, don't tell me you got any more. And I'm like, no, that's it, I'm done. Now, the tool is going to read, the plugin is going to read the files generated by PMD. And you can do cool things like, well, if I click on this advanced button and scroll down, you'll notice that I've got the option to set quality gates. So I can set thresholds and say things like, I'm going to run a static code analysis on my code. I'm going to inspect the quality of the code. And if I find one fatal error, then it doesn't push to production. Or if I find 10 warnings, then we won't do continuous deployment. Or if I find more bugs in this build than the previous build, we won't push to deployment. So I can fail the build, a build that passes all the tests, a build that compiles. I can actually fail it if it fails to meet some of these thresholds. You can see the healthy thresholds, unhealthy thresholds, all of those things there, health, ad severities. So this is kind of cool. You can actually have a build fail based on these things. So that's it. I'm going to click apply. I'm actually going to scroll up just to take one more look at this. So again, this was a Jenkins build job. Nothing configured in the first section. Second section, I pointed to my GitHub repository that has the rock, paper, scissors code in it. Furthermore, it's going to the master branch, no build triggers, no build environments. The build step was simply package, PMD, Findbugs, Checkstyle. And then finally, I just said aggregate the Checkstyle and the PMD and the Findbug results, and maybe set some thresholds as well. Okay, I'm going to click apply, I'm going to click save, and I'm going to click build now. And I'm going to watch this build run. Might take a minute because usually Maven has to download all these plugins the very first time that it runs. So it's going to have to reach out and find PMD and find Checkstyle and find, by the way, Checkstyle has nothing to do with Czechoslovakian standards. That's just a bad joke. But the program's running. I'm going to go in, take a look. It was successful, and of course I didn't put any quality thresholds on here. So if I did put quality thresholds on here, I'm pretty sure there'd be errors, because if I actually look at the log files right now, you'll notice that, well, I got a couple of issues. Now, first of all, notice those links on the left-hand side. We've never seen those before. Those have never been available for any other build that we've done. Checkstyle warnings, Findbug warnings, PMD warnings. Those are totally new. Again, those are new because of the PMD plugin that we installed, right? You add new plugins and new features pop up all over this Jenkins tool. It's pretty amazing. A couple of things we've got here. It says Checkstyle has told me that there's 104 warnings. I'm never going to be allowed into Czechoslovakia. Okay, so here we go. And what are some of the details? So it says that it's seen avoid star imports. It's got a hidden field problem. It's got a left curly brackets in there. I don't believe I did a star import. There's no way. So I'm going to click on that link there. And it's going to say, yeah, in game.java on line number 4. No way. No way. And then boom. There's the bug splat right there. Import javax.swing.star.asterisk.wildcard. And it's even told me using the star form of import should be avoided. So right after the build, right after the compile, this tool is telling me about issues with my code. I can go in and look at Findbugs. Now, Findbugs a bit more serious. Checkstyle will be like, oh, your brackets are out of place and stuff like that. PMD and Findbugs are a little bit more serious. Here it says that you've returned a java.util.date object. That just shows you how old this Java code is. And it says you should never return an entire object. You should return properties of the object, but returning an entire object is not a good design pattern. So it's flagged that, and I can go into PMD warnings as well. And how are we doing on PMD? Well, this has found an unnecessary semicolon. Really? I put an unnecessary semicolon in? It says it's right in there in the desktop game. I don't believe it. I need to see it, and boom, there it is, right after public enum rock, paper, scissors. You don't need a semicolon after that. You can just declare your enum. So we've now seen the ability of this tool to go in and discover bugs, discover problems, discover issues. We could even set up quality gates, quality thresholds with these static code analysis tools in Jenkins and have the build actually fail if there's more than one fatal error, or there's more than 10 warnings. So you can really move your game up as far as enforcing quality in your code. So really cool features. These are just 3 free plugins. There's a wealth of them. Now, one of the interesting things is this is a Jenkins build job. And we did have a Jenkins pipeline earlier that ran the rock, paper, scissors build. So there's build, rock, paper, scissors pipeline. Now this pipeline, it had a number of stages: version, environment, document, compile, acceptance, and conclusion. But it never did static code analysis. So one of the questions that I often get is, can I call a Jenkins build job from a pipeline? And the answer to that question is, of course you can. So right now, I could have a pipeline that runs. You can call these static analysis codes from the pipeline. Just look at the documentation. It's possible. But why, if I've already got that job that actually does static code analysis on this? So here's what I'm going to do. This particular pipeline pulls a Jenkins file from rock, paper, scissors, git. So I'm going to go over to rock, paper, scissors, git. I'm going to find that Jenkins file. I'm going to click edit, and I'm going to go in here, and I'm going to add a stage. So right after the conclusion, I'm going to add a stage, and I'm going to change it from conclusion to almost done. But I'm going to add a stage here. And this stage is static code analysis. And I'm going to use the build job syntax of the Jenkins DSL, right? The domain specific language that Jenkins provides for you to do cool things. And I'm going to say, call the build job called code analysis build job. Oh, hold on a sec. That's not what the build job was called. Let's make sure we call the right one. Static code analysis was the name of the project. Boy, that would be a big error. Well, it'd be a dumb error. So you got to put in the name of the build job properly. But there we go. That's it. So now it's in there. I'm going to commit that change. And once that change is committed, I'm going to mosey on back to Jenkins. I'm going to see the static code analysis. It's been about 6 minutes and 18 seconds since that's run. Okay, so it ran a little while ago. 108 issues reported. That's not good. I was going to say I've never even dated a girl that had that many issues, but that would be a sexist joke, and it's kind of a funny joke. You get it. I've got issues too. Let me see. Okay, going back to the pipeline here. Notice version, environment, document, compile, acceptance, conclusion. I'm going to run this again. Build now. And notice, well, first of all, almost done. This actually asks for input from the user. Proceed. And then after the almost done, you notice we get a brand new one called static code analysis. Now, if I hurry up and go to the dashboard, you'll notice static code analysis is running. So you can see the spinning wheel there. So that piece of code is actually running right now, and that's actually going to run, and the other build job won't be finished until this build job actually completes itself. And here's another thing that's interesting. This build job has the potential to fail the pipeline. So if the pipeline calls on the static analysis code build job and the static code analysis build job fails, then the pipeline that calls it will fail as well. So you can call Jenkins build jobs from pipelines, and if those Jenkins build jobs fail, it kind of daisy chains through, bubbles up through the stack, and that job will fail as well. But we're not in that situation now. We have all of these jobs, they've run, and you notice now the static code analysis is saying that it ran 19 seconds ago, so that's all working properly. So there you go. That is how Jenkins plugins work. It's fairly straightforward. Find the plugin you like, install the corresponding software, configure the plugin. It's a step we didn't have to use with this particular plugin, but that's often in there. And then when you build your Jenkins build jobs or your Jenkins pipelines, just reference the plugin and all of its features will be available to you. It's that easy. So now that we've mastered working with Jenkins plugin, what is next? Well, you know, one thing I see a lot of Jenkins tutorials skip over is credentials, and it's pivotally important. What I'd like to do here is I'd like to go in, create a credential, and the reason I want to create that credential is because the payoff pitch for this entire course is us pulling down a Spring Boot application, compiling it, testing it, packaging it up as an executable jar file, creating a Docker image, and then doing a deployment and pushing that Docker image right into Docker Hub so that anybody can access it and anybody can run it. A full continuous integration, continuous deployment pipeline. Now, in order to do that, in order to push to Docker Hub, I need to provide a username and password. So I need credentials. Here we are. Click on the Jenkins head to get to the landing page and click on Manage Jenkins. If you scroll down, you'll see a security section. And when you hit the security section, look for credentials. Click on credentials and then just dig down through some of the defaults here. You'll see system. Just click on system. You'll see global credentials. We'll just click on global credentials. And then you'll see a lonely page with nothing configured. And here, we want to configure a credential. So I'm going to click Add Credentials. What type of credential is it going to be? For us, it's going to be a username and password credential, but you can see there's a variety of different ones that you can configure. The scope will be global. The username that will be associated here is just my username for logging into Docker Hub. My password is, I'm not telling you my password. You're not going to catch me like that. I do need to provide an ID, a unique identifier for this credential object, so that later on in my pipelines, when I reference it, well, I've got a unique identifier to reference it with. And I'll call it Docker Hub Credentials. Docker Hub Credentials. That looks good. I'll click Create, and now I have a credential object created. And what I'd like to do before I start taking a Spring Boot microservice and deploying it to Docker Hub with Jenkins is I'd like to actually create a new Jenkins pipeline. And I'm just going to call this the Credentials Pipeline. Nothing crazy. It's going to be a pipeline type of project. And I'd like to just print out the credentials. Just see if I can access them. That's it. Nothing crazy, nothing too complicated. In fact, I might even be doing a little copy and paste here. So, but I just want to make sure everything works. So I'm going to start off with a hello world application. I'm going to throw a little script stage in. And by the way, I'm sorry that the code here is so small. I wish it was a little larger. And I'm just going to make a reference to the Jenkins domain-specific language and one of the functions that's available if you've got the appropriate security plugins in there. And that's the withCredentials function. withCredentials will go in and take a look at a credential that you've created. And you notice it says Docker Hub Credentials there. withCredentials will pull that credential out of Docker, and it will allow you to take the username and password variables and assign them variables of your own. So I'm just assigning them the name, username, and password. And then within this block of code, you can use those variables to access the username and password. And so I'm just going to do a batch file to echo out password and username. Yes, you are going to be able to see my password. I'll click Save here, and I will click Build Now. And in the log file, I should be able to show you what my password is for Docker Hub. And so here is Cameron MCNZ as the username. And of course, it masks out the password and tells you, hey, you're a bad person for trying to print out a password using a batch file. And I am a bad person, so I can't argue with that. But that shows you how to access these variables. There's definitely more secure ways to do programming than printing out passwords in a batch file. But this just gets us started, right? Okay, that's the foundation we need. What we need to do next is we need to actually build a Spring Boot application, package that Spring Boot application in an executable jar file, and then finally push that up to Docker Hub. Now, I've got a Spring Boot application here on GitHub. It's called Spock Lizard Docker. As you can see, it comes with a Docker file, so I can use that to actually build an image, build an executable jar file. This looks for a Spock Lizard jar file if Spring builds it, and it puts it into an OpenJDK 8 Alpine Docker image so that it can be run. So this helps me create a Docker image. You'll also notice there's a POM file in there as well. And this POM file has all sorts of stuff about Spring Boot in there. It is a Spring Boot microservice we'll deploy with Jenkins. And then you can see all the details in there. Now, when we're done, I'd like to take the Docker image we create for our Spring Boot microservice and push it to Docker Hub. Once it's in Docker Hub, anybody else can access it, download it, run it, integrate it. Essentially, that's a full deployment of our application as a Docker image into the cloud, into Docker Hub, where it's publicly available for everybody. So we'll actually be simulating a full continuous integration, continuous delivery, continuous deployment pipeline with Jenkins using Spring Boot and Docker. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do here with my Spock Lizard Docker project is just copy the Git URL. We're going to need that on the clipboard. Then I'm going to go over to Jenkins, and I'm going to create a brand new item, and I'm going to call this Spring Boot Jenkins Deployment. It's going to be a Jenkins Pipeline. So I'll click Pipeline here, and I'm going to scroll all the way down, and I'm going to start off with a GitHub and Maven pipeline because I do have that GitHub URL on my clipboard. I'll paste that in there. I'm going to get rid of the tools section. I don't think I really need that. This is going to get busy, so I'll just clarify this a little bit. And I think I'm going to start off with well, it's got to be a batch file because we're on Windows here. And I'm going to do a Maven. I'm not going to do clean package. I'm just going to do a Maven, or not Maven. I'm going to do Maven clean package. Here we go. That looks good to me. But Maven clean. No. I'm not going to do Maven clean package. I'm going to do a Maven clean test and compile. Right? And so this isn't going to be the build stage. This is going to be the compile and test phase. Okay, so I think that looks good. Now, I'm going to have multiple stages here. I'm going to get rid of the post stage, so I don't need that. Okay, so that looks good. I'm going to click apply at this point in time. I don't see any errors, and all my braces seem like they line up, which makes me happy. Now I'm going to add another stage here, a little copy and paste action to add this second stage. And the steps are going to be a little bit different. What I'm going to do here is, I don't know, what should I do here? Maybe I'll build the Spring Boot jar file. So build the Spring Boot jar file with Jenkins. And for that, that's just going to be a simple Maven batch command. So I'll tidy up some of the extra stuff here. Although it does actually have a little bit of Spring Booty stuff in it. So the command to do this with Spring Boot is Maven clean package Spring Boot : repackage. And so let me see, do I have a brace out of line? Looks like I do. Okay, there we go. And that should make Jenkins happy. You got to keep your braces straight. Okay, and what do I do after that? Well, after the Spring Boot executable jar is created, the next sensible thing to do is, I need another stage here. I'm afraid to copy and paste just because I don't want to mess up my brackets. That bracket there, that bracket there, that bracket there. I'm pretty sure I've missed a bracket at some point in time. Oh no, I think I'm good. So we're going to add another stage now. And this stage will be creating the Docker image. Now for this, it's just another batch command that's going to call Docker build. And there's actually a Docker plugin. We just talked about Jenkins plugins. There's actually a Docker plugin that will simplify this. So if I install the Docker plugin, I could just do Docker build and then the name of the Docker image I wanted to build. Alternatively, you can just do the Docker build command and give your image a name. So my image is going to be named RPS for Jenkins tutorial : latest. Okay, now I have my final stage. And I'm going to paste this in because it is plenty long. And the final stage is deploy to Docker Hub. And as you can see here, as I deploy to Docker Hub, I need that credentials object, right? So with credentials right there. And what I do is I pull those credentials out. I assign them the variables username and password. I'm not particularly creative in that naming. But then I do a Docker login. And notice in the Docker login, I've used that username and password properties. So I do that login. By doing that, I am then able to do the Docker push command, which allows me to push all of my code up to Docker Hub. And so if all of this works and all of this compiles, well, I should be able to pull, compile, test, run, and do everything that I need to do in order to push a Spring Boot microservice out to Docker Hub using Jenkins. I think that's pretty impressive. So I'm going to click Save. I'm going to click Build Now, and I'm going to cross my fingers, hold my breath, Looks like it's going. Compile and test seems to be running. It's going to take a while to pull that code down from GitHub through Jenkins, but it's working. And I know what the error is. The error is I don't have Docker running. So I'm going to run Docker. Boy, that was a disappointment. I thought it was going to run. So I'm going to run Docker. And there we go. The Docker engine is starting. As you can see, I'm using Docker Desktop for Windows. And now that it's started, I'm going to run this again. Okay, build now. Let's see if our next attempt will succeed. And yes, it says that it succeeded, but the proof is in the plum pudding. So let's go over here to my Docker Hub account. And oh no, Docker Cam RPS service, that's not what we named it. Over here in the configuration, when we said to push that image up, we actually gave it the name RPS for Jenkins tutorial latest. And look at that, it's not up there. I'm just joking, I didn't refresh. There we go, we do a little refresh on Docker Hub, and boom, Cameron MCNZ RPS for Jenkins tutorial is right up there. And we've now actually deployed our application, pulled it from GitHub, brought it locally, built it, packaged it, tested it, created a Docker image out of it, and then taken that Docker image and passed some credentials, logged into Docker Hub, and pushed it up into the cloud. And I would say that is pretty amazing. And that is a pretty awesome Jenkins pipeline. So anyways, I think that's going to conclude this Jenkins course. And if you stuck around this long, God bless you. I do appreciate it. I do have a couple of other tutorials on Jenkins that go into a little bit more detail on building pipelines and interacting with SonarQube and stuff like that. But if you got this far, you are very dangerous when it comes to CI, CD, Jenkins, and automating your deployments. It's really impressive how far we got. Now, before we go, a couple of things to mention. I don't know if you know this, but I wrote a little book on The Simpsons a little while ago. It's called Pickering is Springfield, available on Amazon. And it's all about how the fabled town of Springfield is actually based on Pickering, Ontario, a small town outside of Toronto where I grew up as a kid. For example, the highway that goes through Springfield in The Simpsons is the 401. The highway that goes through Pickering is the 401. Springfield is 30 miles from Capital City, where they play in a dome stadium. Pickering is 50 kilometers, 30 miles from Toronto, where their Major League Baseball team plays in a dome stadium. So check out that book, Pickering is Springfield. Also, I wrote a number of Java books, so Hybrid 8 and JPA Made Easy is available as well. So if you're into that type of thing, check out my Hibernate books, my JPA books. Also got some on Spring and Git coming out too, so take a look for those. And then also I've been working with a young freelancer over on the server side, and her name's Darcy DeClute, Scrumptious on Twitter, and she wrote this Scrum Master certification guide, which I can't recommend highly enough. If you're into Agile, into Scrum, definitely pick this book up. It'll get you Scrum Master certified, and will help your career. As for me, if you want to follow me, I'm Cameron MCNZ on Twitter. You can get access to all my personal antics over there. I'm also the editor-in-chief of the server side, as I've mentioned several times throughout this course. Head over there, check out some of the tutorials that we've got on Docker, DevOps, microservices, Agile, Scrum, Java, Python, you name it. If you enjoyed this tutorial, why don't you subscribe on YouTube?